June 6th, 1816, Vermont. A farmer wakes before dawn to check his fields. It's early summer, the crops should be growing, the air should be warm, the season should be promising. He steps outside and stops. Everything is white, not morning dew, not fog, snow. In June, his corn, barely sprouted, is covered in frost. By afternoon, when the temperature climbs back above freezing, the plants are dead, blackened, gone. He'll replant, and it'll freeze again and again, because summer in 1816 doesn't arrive. Not in Vermont, not in New England, not anywhere. Across the Atlantic, in Switzerland, farmers are watching their fields drown under endless rain. The crops that don't freeze are rotting in waterlogged soil. In France, by November, grapes are still hard and green on the vine. They never ripened because the warmth never came. In Britain, grain prices double, then triple. In Germany, families are eating bread made from sawdust and moss because there's no wheat. This isn't a bad harvest. This is summer breaking, globally, simultaneously, and nobody understands why. The sun still rose every morning, but it looked wrong. Dimmer, strange colors, like looking through dirty glass. The temperatures stayed cold. The rain never stopped. And across Europe and North America, people started starving because the planet had glitched. The cause was a volcano on an island most people had never heard of, Mount Tambora in Indonesia, that had erupted the previous year with such violence. It injected so much sulfur into the stratosphere that it created a haze that scattered sunlight, dropped global temperatures, and made 1816 the year summer disappeared. This is a story about how one geological event rewired the lives of millions, triggered famines, riots, mass migration, and somehow managed to inspire both Frankenstein and the bicycle. If you're here because you want to understand how quickly our world can change when natural forces decide to remind us we're not in control, you're in the right place. And if these deep dives into history's strangest disasters are what you value, subscribing helps me keep making them. This is 1816, the year summer never came, and how a volcano nobody saw coming changed everything. April 10th, 1815, Sumbawa Island, Indonesia. Mount Tambora has been rumbling for days. Small earthquakes, steam venting from the summit, warning signs that something is building. The local population, tens of thousands living on the island and its slopes, can feel the mountain waking up. That evening, Tambora explodes. Not erupts, explodes. This is the largest volcanic eruption in recorded human history, and what happens over the next several days is violence on a scale that's almost impossible to comprehend. The entire top of the mountain disintegrates. Where there was a peak over 4,000 meters high, there's suddenly a crater, a caldera 6 kilometers wide and over a kilometer deep. The mountain has removed itself from existence. The eruption column, the tower of ash and gas blasting upward, reaches heights estimated at 43 kilometers into the atmosphere. That's well into the stratosphere, the layer above where weather happens, where there's no rain to wash particles out. Material ejected that high can circle the globe and stay suspended for years. The ash doesn't just go up, it comes down. Over 150 cubic kilometers of tephra, volcanic rock fragments, ash, pumice, falls across Indonesia. Some areas are buried under meters of ash. The immediate devastation is total. Villages disappear. Crops are destroyed. Water sources are contaminated. The sound of the eruption is heard 2,600 kilometers away. Ships hundreds of kilometers from the volcano report ash falling so thick they mistake it for a sudden nightfall. Tsunamis triggered by the eruption strike surrounding coastlines, some waves reaching 4 meters high. On Sumbawa itself and nearby islands, the death toll from the immediate eruption, the ash, the tsunamis, the pyroclastic flows, is in the tens of thousands. But that's just the beginning. The ash buries agricultural land so completely that nothing can grow. Famine spreads across the Indonesian islands. By the time the immediate crisis ends, approximately 60,000 people have died, some from the eruption itself, most from starvation in the months that follow, when the ash-covered land can't produce food. This is catastrophic for Indonesia. But Indonesia is remote from Europe and North America. News travels slowly in 1815. Most of the Western world doesn't even hear about Tambora for months. They have no idea that a volcano has just injected something into the atmosphere that will reach them within weeks and change their lives within a year. Because it's not the ash that matters for global climate. Ash falls out relatively quickly. It's the sulfur dioxide. Tambora injected an estimated 60 megatons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. When sulfur dioxide reaches that high altitude, it reacts with water vapor to form sulfate aerosols, tiny droplets of sulfuric acid suspended in the upper atmosphere. These aerosols don't fall out quickly. They spread globally, carried by stratospheric winds, forming a thin haze that encircles the planet. And this haze does something simple but devastating. It scatters sunlight. Instead of solar radiation reaching the surface and warming the Earth, a portion of it gets reflected back into space. The planet starts cooling. It's not immediate. The eruption happens in April 1815. The aerosols take time to spread fully, but by late 1815 and into 1816, the haze is global, and the cooling effect is being felt everywhere. The planet's temperature drops by an estimated 0.4 to 0.7 degrees Celsius on average, which sounds small until you realize that's a global average. Regional effects are far more severe. In Europe and North America, summer temperatures in 1816 dropped by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius below the 1951 to 1980 baseline. That's enormous. That's the difference between crops growing and crops failing, between summer and extended spring, between abundance and famine. And nobody knows why it's happening. The people experiencing the cold summer and endless rain in 1816 have no idea a volcano in Indonesia is responsible. They can see the sun looks dim and strange. They can see the bizarre sunsets, vivid reds and purples caused by the aerosols scattering light. But they don't understand atmospheric chemistry or global climate systems. They just know summer is broken. The stage is set. Tambora has fired a bullet into the stratosphere, and that bullet is about to hit millions of people who never saw it coming. Spring 1816 starts normally enough. March temperatures across Europe and North America are close to average. April is a bit cool, but nothing alarming. May shows some concerning cold snaps. And then June arrives, and something goes very wrong. In New England, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, there's snow. In June, multiple times. June 6th sees widespread frost that kills newly planted crops. June 7th and 8th bring more freezing temperatures. In some areas, snow accumulates several inches deep. In summer, farmers who've just planted corn, wheat, and other crops watch them die overnight. They replant. It freezes again. Some try a third time. The pattern repeats through early June. Brief warm spells followed by sudden cold snaps and frost that kill anything that started growing. In Quebec, there's a foot of snow on June 6th. This isn't a fluke storm. This is the climate system malfunctioning. Summer should be starting. Instead, winter keeps returning. Cross the Atlantic to Europe, and the problem is different but equally devastating. It's not frost that's the primary threat. It's rain. Endless, relentless rain. In parts of Western and Central Europe, June 1816 receives approximately twice the normal rainfall. Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, all experiencing the same pattern of cold and wet. The rain doesn't just fall, it bounds, it floods, it turns fields into swamps. In Switzerland, farmers describe an unending rain that begins in spring and continues through summer. The water doesn't drain because the soil is already saturated. Seeds rot before they can sprout. Plants that do grow get waterlogged and die. Temperature records from the period show the scale of the anomaly. In Western and Central Europe, summer temperatures in 1816 averaged 2 to 4 degrees Celsius below the 1951 to 1980 reference period. That might not sound dramatic, but in agricultural terms, it's catastrophic. Those few degrees are the difference between a growing season and a failed season. July doesn't bring relief. The cold and wet continue. In New England, there's frost in July. Frost. In midsummer, August, which should be the peak of summer warmth, the height of the growing season, brings more of the same. Frost on August 21st across much of New England kills what little crops manage to survive the June frosts. In Europe, the pattern holds. Cold, wet, grey. The sun appears when it appears at all, dimmed and strange. People describe it as having a peculiar appearance. Colors seem off. The light seems weak. They're seeing the effect of the sulfate aerosol haze scattering sunlight, though they don't know what they're looking at. The psychological impact is profound. In pre-industrial societies, people live close to nature. They understand seasons. They depend on seasonal patterns for survival. And in 1816, the pattern is broken. Summer, the season of growth, warmth, abundance, has been replaced with something that feels wrong. Extended spring at best. False summer that keeps promising warmth and delivering cold. Contemporary accounts capture the strangeness. Newspapers report the backward season and unprecedented cold. Diaries describe anxiety about the harvest, fear about winter food supplies, confusion about why the weather refuses to behave normally. Some interpret it as divine punishment. Others see it as an omen of worse to come. Most just try to survive it. In New England, some farmers give up entirely on grain crops and focus on root vegetables that might survive the short, cold growing season. Some slaughter livestock early because they can't afford to feed them through winter without adequate hay harvests. Some make desperate decisions about which family members get how much of the limited food available. In the Alps, Switzerland, parts of Austria, and southern Germany, the situation is particularly dire. These mountainous regions have short growing seasons even in normal years. In 1816, with summer temperatures dropping and rain flooding valleys, the harvest fails almost completely. Crops that might have survived cold can't survive being drowned. Stored grain from previous harvests runs out. By autumn, people are eating anything they can find: grass, moss, tree bark. And this is where the weird weather story becomes something darker. Because failed harvests mean food shortages. Food shortages mean price spikes. Price spikes mean poor people can't afford to eat. And when poor people can't afford to eat, societies start breaking down in ways that governments can't control. The year without a summer is about to become the year of famine, riots, and migration. The climate shock is transforming into a human crisis. And that crisis will reshape Europe and North America in ways that echo for generations. By autumn 1816, the scale of the agricultural disaster is undeniable. This isn't a local crop failure or a regional bad harvest. This is continental scale collapse. Let's start with what harvest season should look like. September and October are when European farmers bring in grain crops: wheat, rye, barley, oats. It's when fruits ripen and are collected, when root vegetables are dug up and stored, when farmers assess whether they've grown enough to feed their families and livestock through winter and have surplus to sell at market. In 1816, that process breaks down completely. In France and Switzerland, grapevines that should have produced ripe grapes by September are still showing hard green fruit in early November. The grapes never ripened because there wasn't enough warmth or sunlight. Wine production, a major economic and cultural activity across much of Europe, collapses. This isn't just about losing wine, it's about losing income for wine producers, losing tax revenue for governments, losing a commodity that's part of daily life and international trade. Grain harvests are even worse. In Britain and Ireland, wheat and barley crops fail under the combination of cold temperatures and excessive rain. Fields that should be golden with ripe grain are instead sparse and stunted. What does grow often rots in the waterlogged soil before it can be harvested. The grain that is harvested is often poor quality, small kernels, low nutrition, prone to mold. In Wales, local records describe the harvest as one of the worst in memory. In Ireland, where much of the population already lives close to subsistence, the failed harvest pushes communities towards starvation. Potatoes, a dietary staple, suffer as well. Too much rain and cold soil create conditions for blight and rot. In Switzerland and southern Germany, the alpine regions where growing seasons are shortest, the situation becomes desperate first. By late 1816, food stores are running critically low. The previous year's reserves have been consumed. The 1816 harvest has failed. And winter is coming. People start eating things that would normally never be consumed as food. Contemporary accounts describe bread made from ground tree bark, from sawdust mixed with whatever grain can be found, from moss and lichens scraped off rocks. This isn't supplementing diet. This is desperation eating, consuming things with minimal nutrition just to fill stomachs. Livestock suffer alongside humans. Hay harvests failed along with grain, which means there's no fodder for cattle, horses, sheep. Farmers face impossible choices. Slaughter animals early and have meat now, but no animals for work or breeding next year. Or try to keep animals alive through winter on inadequate feed and watch them starve slowly. Many choose slaughter. Meat becomes briefly more available and prices drop temporarily as farmers dump animals they can't feed. But this is a false abundance. It's consuming future capacity for immediate survival. Once those animals are gone, there's no easy way to replace them. Breeding stock is lost. Working animals are lost. The agricultural system's ability to recover is damaged. And the harvest failure doesn't just affect farmers, it cascades through entire economies. Millers have no grain to grind. Bakers have no flour to bake. Markets have no food to sell. Workers in cities who depend on purchased food find shelves empty or prices impossibly high. The whole economic chain that connects farms to cities breaks down when the fundamental input, grown food, disappears. By winter 1816 to 1817, the food situation across much of Europe is critical, and this is when price becomes the story that determines who survives and who doesn't. Price spikes don't happen smoothly. They happen in jolts that track with news and scarcity. And in late 1816 and through 1817, grain prices across Europe double, triple, in some regions quadruple. When harvests fail, the immediate response is to sell from storage. Grain that was held back from previous years gets released to market. This buffers prices initially, but by early 1817, those reserves are exhausted. The 1816 harvest was inadequate. Storage is empty, and the 1817 growing season hasn't started yet. There won't be new food for months. The price rises are most severe in inland areas. Coastal cities with access to ports can import grain from regions less affected or from overseas suppliers. London and Hamburg see price increases, but not as extreme as interior cities and towns. The cost of overland transport is high enough that moving grain from ports inland is expensive, which means interior markets are more isolated and more vulnerable. In Switzerland, grain prices in 1817 reached levels not seen in living memory. Records from the period show wheat prices roughly tripling compared to pre-crisis levels. For wealthy families, this is uncomfortable. For poor families, this is catastrophic. When you're already spending most of your income on food in normal times, a tripling of prices means you simply cannot afford to eat. The same pattern repeats across Europe. In parts of Germany, riots break out at markets. Hungry crowds confront merchants they accuse of hoarding or profiteering. In some cases, mobs storm granaries and take food by force. Governments respond with troops, which sometimes prevents escalation and sometimes makes it worse. In Britain, the government faces pressure to restrict grain exports, to keep British grain for British people rather than selling it overseas where prices might be higher. Export restrictions get imposed in some regions but not others, creating arbitrage opportunities and black markets. Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, is exporting grain to Britain even as Irish people starve. A pattern that will repeat more devastatingly in the 1840s during the potato famine. Charity efforts emerge but can't match the scale of need. Churches and local authorities set up relief programs. In St. Gallen, Switzerland, a pastor collects so many donations of bread, meat, and other goods for distribution to the poor that he needs to hire a man with a donkey just to transport it all. This is touching. It's also inadequate. Private charity, no matter how generous, cannot replace a failed continental harvest. Some governments try price controls. The theory is simple. Make it illegal to charge more than a certain amount for grain, bread, other staples. The reality is that price controls without increasing supply just create shortages. If you cap prices below what it costs to produce or transport food, suppliers stop bringing food to market. Black markets emerge. Corruption spreads. The people who suffer most are still the poor, who can't access black market supplies or pay bribes. The political consequences ripple outward. In France, still politically volatile after the Napoleonic Wars and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, food riots threaten stability. The government deploys troops to maintain order, but using military force against hungry citizens strains legitimacy. Revolutionary sentiment, never far below the surface in post-Napoleonic France, finds new fuel in the perception that the government can't or won't feed the people. In German states, which are fragmented into dozens of separate jurisdictions, some rulers block grain exports to prevent their own subjects from starving, while neighboring states do the same, creating a cascade of export bans that makes the crisis worse by preventing grain from moving to where it's most needed. This is the paradox of the 1817 food crisis. There's probably enough grain in Europe collectively to prevent mass starvation if it could be distributed efficiently, but the political, economic, and logistical systems needed to move food from surplus regions to deficit regions don't exist at the scale required. So people starve in some areas, while others have relative abundance. And for many people, the only solution is to leave. If you can't afford food where you are, if the prospect is starvation or watching your children starve, then migration becomes the rational choice, even when migration is expensive, dangerous, and unlikely to succeed. The famine of 1816 to 1817 triggers the largest wave of European migration to North America since the colonial period. But here's the cruel irony. The people most desperate to leave are often the ones who can't afford to. Transatlantic passage in the early 19th century is expensive. Estimates suggest fewer than 60,000 people managed to cross the Atlantic during 1816 to 1817, mostly from Britain and Ireland. These are people with some resources, enough to afford passage, enough to survive the journey, enough to imagine starting over in America. For many Germans and Swiss experiencing equally severe famine, the cost of transatlantic passage is prohibitively high. They can't afford to leave even when staying means potentially starving. Some attempt overland migration to other European regions, but this often just moves the problem, arriving as destitute refugees in regions that are also struggling with food shortages. The migrants who do make it to North America find conditions that are also difficult. Remember, New England experienced the same failed harvests in 1816. The American Northeast is dealing with its own food crisis. The advantage is that the United States has a larger frontier, land farther south and west that was less affected, and migration within America is easier than across the Atlantic. So what happens is a double migration. European migrants arrive in American port cities, and then many of them immediately move west or south, seeking better conditions. They're joining a flow of American internal migrants who are also abandoning the Northeast for regions with more successful harvests. The 1816 climate shock accelerates American westward expansion by making eastern agricultural regions less viable. But migration is a privilege. Most people can't move. They stay and try to survive through a combination of any resources they have, any charity they can access, and any adaptations they can manage. The charity efforts are remarkable and insufficient. Churches become distribution centers. Wealthy families sponsor relief programs. Local authorities organize soup kitchens. Contemporaries describe scenes of lines of people waiting for bread distribution, families sending children to beg at wealthy homes, communities coming together to share what little they have. There's also innovation born of desperation. People experiment with substitute foods, trying to make bread from ingredients that normally wouldn't be used, finding wild plants that might be edible, developing preservation techniques to make limited food last longer. Some of these experiments are practical and help people survive. Some are dangerous and make people sick. The crisis also tests social structures in ways that vary by region and class. In some communities, social bonds strengthen as people help each other survive. In others, social breakdown occurs. Theft increases. Violent crime rises. Trust erodes when everyone is desperate. By late 1817 and into 1818, conditions begin to improve. Harvests in 1817 are still below normal, but better than 1816. The sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere are gradually settling out. Global temperatures are recovering. Summer is coming back, but the recovery is uneven. Some regions bounce back quickly, others take years. Some families have lost everything, livestock, land, family members, and can't recover at all. The social and economic damage lingers even after the immediate food crisis ends. And while millions are struggling to survive, a very small number of people trapped indoors by the terrible weather are creating things that will outlive the crisis itself. June 1816, Lake Geneva, Switzerland, Villa Diodati, a rented house overlooking the lake. Inside, a group of young British literary figures are trapped by the weather, watching rain pour down day after day, watching storms roll across the water, watching a summer that refuses to arrive. The group includes Lord Byron, one of the most famous poets of the era, controversial, brilliant, in self-imposed exile from England, his personal physician, John Polidori, Percy Bysshe Shelley, another major poet, radical thinker, Byron's friend, Shelley's lover, soon-to-be wife, Mary Godwin, just 18 years old, and Mary's stepsister, Claire Clairmont. They came to Geneva for the summer. They expected to be outside, sailing, hiking, enjoying the Alps. Instead, they're stuck indoors because the weather is relentlessly awful. Day after day of cold rain, storms, grey skies. The kind of weather that makes you feel trapped, claustrophobic, like the walls are closing in. One evening, trapped inside once again, Byron suggests a challenge to pass the time. They've been reading ghost stories, German tales of the supernatural translated into French. Byron proposes, each person should write their own ghost story. It's entertainment, a game, a way to fill the dark, dreary hours. Most of the stories that emerge from this challenge are forgotten. Polidori writes something that becomes The Vampire, which has some influence on the genre. Byron starts something and abandons it. Shelley participates, but doesn't produce anything substantial. Mary Shelley, Mary Godwin at the time, struggles initially. She can't think of an idea that feels worthy. She listens to the others discuss philosophy, science, the nature of life. They talk about galvanism, the experiments using electricity to animate dead tissue. They talk about whether life could be created artificially, whether death could be reversed. And one night, she has what she later describes as a waking dream, a vision of a pale student kneeling beside a creature he's assembled, a creature that shows signs of life. She sees the horror of creation without responsibility, of ambition without ethics. She starts writing the next day. The novel that emerges is Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. It won't be published until 1818, but it's conceived and largely written during the summer of 1816, the summer without a summer, the summer when volcanic ash from Tambora kept them trapped inside a Swiss villa. The connection isn't incidental. The mood of Frankenstein, dark, foreboding, the sense of nature rebelling, of creation gone wrong, reflects the atmosphere of that terrible summer. The novel's themes of ambition destroying its creator, of meddling with forces beyond control, of consequences spiraling beyond intention. These resonate with a summer that felt like the natural order had broken. Byron also writes during this period. His poem, Darkness, is explicitly about the end of the world, about the sun being extinguished, about humanity descending into chaos as light disappears. It's apocalyptic, and it's directly influenced by the dim, strange sun of 1816, the endless gloom, the sense that summer has been cancelled by forces nobody understands. The artistic output of that haunted summer at Villa Diodati has cultural impact far beyond what anyone present could have imagined. Frankenstein becomes one of the defining works of Gothic literature, influences science fiction as a genre, becomes an archetype that's still referenced constantly in modern culture. The Byronic hero, moody, isolated, brilliant, self-destructive, is partly forged during this period. But while the wealthy literary figures are creating art from their discomfort, millions of ordinary people are just trying to survive. The same volcanic eruption that gave us Frankenstein also gave us starvation, migration, and social upheaval across 2 continents. There's something darkly fitting about this. A natural disaster creates the conditions for both mass suffering and creative breakthrough. The same cold, dark summer that kills crops and drives people from their homes also forces Byron and the Shelleys indoors, where boredom and gloom spark one of literature's most enduring works. And the ripples of Tambora don't stop at literature. They touch technology in ways that are even more unexpected. Here's a technology origin story that sounds too neat to be true, but has enough documentary evidence that it's worth examining. The invention of the bicycle as a response to the 1816 crisis. The story goes like this. The harvest failures of 1816 don't just affect human food supplies, they also affect animal feed. Hay harvests fail. Oat harvests fail. The grain and forage that horses depend on become scarce and expensive. Keeping horses fed through the winter of 1816 to 1817 becomes prohibitively expensive for many people. Horses aren't just transportation, they're essential to the entire economy. They pull wagons, plows, carriages. They're how goods move, how agriculture works, how people travel any distance. A society without horses functions very differently, far less efficiently. In 1817, a German inventor named Karl Dreiss, full name Karl von Dreiss, a civil servant and inventor, creates something he calls a loaf machine, running machine. In English, it becomes known as the draisine or velocipede. It's a 2-wheeled wooden device that you sit on and propel by pushing your feet against the ground, essentially running while seated, with wheels allowing you to coast between pushes. It looks absurd by modern standards. No pedals, no chain, just a wooden frame, 2 wheels and handlebars. But it works. Dreiss demonstrates it publicly in Mannheim in June 1817. He rides it 7 kilometers in less than an hour, faster than walking, without requiring a horse. The question historians debate is, how much is this invention directly motivated by the horse feed crisis of 1816 to 1817? Dreiss himself doesn't explicitly write, "I invented this because of crop failures." But the timing is suggestive. The draisine appears in 1817, immediately after the worst of the feed crisis. It's a vehicle designed to replace horse-based transport for individual mobility. Some accounts treat this as obvious cause and effect. Feed shortage, expensive horses, invention of human-powered alternative. Other historians are more cautious, noting that Dries was already experimenting with wheeled vehicles before 1816, and that attributing a complex invention to a single cause oversimplifies. What we can say with confidence: the draisine is invented and demonstrated in 1817. It represents the first practical two-wheeled human-powered vehicle. The historical context is a period when maintaining horses is unusually expensive. The invention gains attention and some commercial interest quickly, suggesting it addresses a real need. The draisine itself doesn't immediately transform transportation. It's uncomfortable, difficult to use, requires relatively smooth roads. It becomes a curiosity more than a revolution, but it establishes a concept. Human-powered wheeled vehicles are viable. Over the following decades, inventors will add pedals, chains, pneumatic tires, gearing, brakes. The draisine evolves into the penny farthing, then into the safety bicycle, then into the modern bicycle. By the late 19th century, bicycles are transforming mobility, recreation, and even social norms about women's freedom of movement. But the chain of innovation arguably starts with Carl Dries in 1817, possibly motivated at least partly by a volcanic eruption that killed summer and made horses too expensive. It's a strange chain of causation: Indonesian volcano, global cooling, crop failure, feed shortage, search for transport alternatives, invention that eventually helps create modern cycling culture. Not every consequence of Tambora is this indirect or this positive. Most of the consequences are human suffering that doesn't produce literary masterpieces or technological innovations. Most of the consequences are just tragedy: people who died, communities that were destroyed, lives that were derailed. But the strange side effects, Frankenstein and bicycles, remind us that historical events ripple outward in unpredictable ways. A volcano erupts, the sun dims, summer fails, and the cascade of consequences includes both horror and creativity, both destruction and invention. The people living through 1816 didn't understand what was happening to them. They could see the effects: cold, rain, failed harvests, but they couldn't explain the mechanism. It would take over a century before scientists could definitively connect volcanic eruptions to global temperature drops and understand the atmospheric chemistry involved. Let's walk through what actually happened, because understanding the mechanism helps us understand both historical climate disasters and future risks. When Tambora erupted in 1815, it ejected two primary types of material: solid matter, ash, pumice, rock fragments, and gases, particularly sulfur dioxide, water vapor, carbon dioxide. The solid matter is dramatic and locally devastating. It buries nearby areas, creates tsunamis, blocks sunlight immediately in the surrounding region. But solid particles are heavy and fall out of the atmosphere relatively quickly. Within weeks or months, most of the ash has settled. The sulfur dioxide is different. It's a gas, which means it doesn't fall out like ash does. And when Tambora injected approximately 60 megatons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, the layer of atmosphere above where weather occurs, it created conditions for something more persistent. In the stratosphere, sulfur dioxide reacts with water vapor through a series of chemical processes to form sulfate aerosols. These are tiny droplets, particles of sulfuric acid suspended in the air. They're small enough to remain suspended for months or years. They're high enough that rainfall can't wash them out, and they spread globally, carried by stratospheric winds. These sulfate aerosols don't block sunlight completely. They scatter it. When sunlight hits these particles, some of it reflects back towards space. Some of it gets diffused in different directions. The net effect is that less solar radiation reaches the Earth's surface in a direct, warming fashion. More of it gets reflected or scattered before it can warm the planet. The result is cooling. The 1816 global average temperature drop was somewhere between 0.4 and 0.7 degrees Celsius, which sounds modest until you remember that's an average across the entire planet. Regional effects, particularly in the northern hemisphere mid-latitudes, where the aerosols were most concentrated, were significantly larger. The 2 to 4 degrees Celsius drops in European summer temperatures were regional manifestations of a global phenomenon. Modern climate modeling has allowed scientists to run simulations of the Tambora eruption and its effects. A 2019 study found that the Tambora forcing made the extreme cold anomaly in Europe up to 100 times more likely than it would have been without the volcanic injection. This isn't saying Tambora caused every aspect of 1816's weather. Natural climate variability always plays a role, but the eruption was the dominant driver of the temperature anomalies. The aerosols also affected precipitation patterns. Cooling the surface changes atmospheric circulation, which affects where moisture flows and where it precipitates. This explains why some regions experienced excessive rain, like Western Europe, while others experienced different precipitation anomalies. The global climate system was perturbed, and the perturbation manifested differently in different locations. By 1818, global temperatures were returning toward normal levels. The sulfate aerosols had largely settled out of the stratosphere. The direct climatic effect of Tambora was ending, but the human consequences continued. Societies recovering from famine, economies rebuilding, political systems dealing with the after effects of unrest and migration. Understanding volcanic forcing of climate has become critical for modern climate science. We know that large volcanic eruptions cause temporary cooling that can last years. We know the mechanism. We know how to identify volcanic signatures in ice cores, tree rings, and other climate proxies. This knowledge helps us interpret past climate changes and also understand future risks. Because Tambora isn't unique. It's the largest eruption in recorded history. But it's not the largest eruption that Earth is capable of producing. The geological record shows even larger eruptions in the deep past. The Toba supervolcano, 74,000 years ago, was vastly larger. More recently, eruptions like Krakatoa in 1883 and Pinatubo in 1991 demonstrated that volcanic climate forcing is an ongoing risk, not just a historical curiosity. The 1991 Pinatubo eruption in the Philippines caused measurable global cooling of about 0.5 degrees Celsius for roughly 2 years. That's smaller and shorter than Tambora's effects, but it was still enough to disrupt agriculture, affect weather patterns, and remind modern civilization that volcanic activity can perturb global systems. We can now monitor volcanic activity more closely, predict some eruptions with some advance warning, and understand the potential climate impacts. But we still can't prevent volcanic eruptions. We can't clear sulfate aerosols from the stratosphere once they're there. We can only prepare for the consequences and try to build resilient systems that can handle climate shocks when they inevitably occur. The lesson of Tambora and 1816 is partly about the past, understanding what happened and why. But it's also about the present and future, recognizing that our climate system can be disrupted by forces we don't control, and that disruptions cascade through agricultural, economic, and social systems in ways that amplify the original shock. By 1817, summer was coming back. The harvests that year were still below normal, but better than 1816. By 1818, conditions had largely returned to pre-Tambora climate. The sulfate aerosols had settled out. The sun looked normal again. The planet had absorbed the shock and was recovering. But the human consequences took far longer to fade. The people who starved during the 1816 to 1817 famine were dead and couldn't be brought back. The families who lost land or livestock or migrated away from their homes had their lives permanently altered. The social and political changes triggered by the crisis, the riots, the migrations, the governmental responses, had effects that rippled forward for years. And the cultural products of that strange summer, Frankenstein, Byron's dark poetry, the draisine that eventually led to bicycles, became part of human civilization in ways that outlasted the climate shock that inspired them. Tambora demonstrates something critical about how our world works. Local events can have global consequences. Natural systems can override human plans. And the cascade of effects from a single shock can be far larger and stranger than anyone could predict. One volcano on an Indonesian island kills summer across Europe and North America. The failed summer kills harvests. The failed harvests drive famine and migration. The famine inspires both art and invention. The art and invention become part of our shared culture centuries later. We live on a planet where these connections are real, where volcanic eruptions and climate systems and human societies are all linked in ways we still don't fully understand. Tambora happened over 200 years ago, and we now understand the mechanism, can predict similar effects from future eruptions, and have built systems that are somewhat more resilient than 1816 societies were. But somewhat more resilient isn't the same as immune. A Tambora-scale eruption today would still disrupt global agriculture, still cause food price spikes, still strain political systems and trigger migrations. We're better prepared than 1816. We're not prepared enough that it wouldn't be catastrophic. The year without a summer is a reminder that we share this planet with forces that don't care about our economies or our politics or our plans. Volcanoes erupt when geological processes dictate, not when it's convenient. And when they erupt on the scale of Tambora, summer disappears, harvests fail, and millions of people suffer consequences they did nothing to cause. If this deep dive into one of history's strangest climate disasters changed how you think about how connected our systems are, how vulnerable we remain to natural forces, how quickly abundance can turn to scarcity when the climate shifts, I'd appreciate if you subscribed. There are more stories like this, moments when nature reminded humanity that we are not as in control as we think. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening to the story of the year summer never came. And remember, somewhere, right now, there's a volcano building toward an eruption that might do it all over again. See you in the next one.